secret could a quiet maid hold that would shatter the world of a man who has everything? Alistair Finch was a titan of industry, a billionaire whose heart was as cold as the marble floors of his mansion. He commanded empires from his desk and had forgotten the meaning of tears. But one Tuesday afternoon, his maid of 20 years, Clara May Thompson, did the unthinkable. She broke her silence. She approached his throne of power, leaned in, and whispered a single sentence about his long-dead wife. Moments later, the unbreakable man was reduced to sobs, his multi-billion-dollar world collapsing around a secret hidden in plain sight. Stay with us as we unravel the story of how a single whisper changed everything. Greycliff Manor wasn't a home, it was a monument. Perched on a cliff overlooking the turbulent Atlantic, its granite walls and vast sterile windows were a testament to the indomitable will of its owner, Alistair Finch. To the world, Alistair was a legend, a self-made billionaire who had clawed his way from a modest background to the zenith of global finance with Finch Global Enterprises. His name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear in boardrooms from New York to Tokyo. Inside the manor, however, the silence was the most valuable commodity. It was a thick, oppressive silence that smothered laughter and clung to the extravagant furniture like dust. At 68, Alistair's face was a roadmap of ruthless decisions and sleepless nights. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his suits were impeccably tailored, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing and felt nothing. His world operated on a precise, unyielding schedule, a schedule maintained with quiet efficiency by his staff. Chief among them was Clara May Thompson. A woman in her early 60s, Clara May was as much a fixture of the manor as the imposing grandfather clock in the foyer. For 20 years she had moved through its cavernous halls with a silent grace that made her almost invisible. She was the head of housekeeping, but her role was far more integral. She was the house's memory, its silent witness. Clara May had seen it all. She had seen the vibrant, warm laughter of Eleanor Finch Alistair's late wife slowly fade over the years, replaced by a quiet melancholy. She had seen their son Julian grow from a bright, imaginative boy into a withdrawn young man of 25, his artistic passions a constant source of disappointment for his titan of a father. And she had seen Alistair, after Eleanor's sudden death from an aneurysm 5 years ago, encase his heart in a fortress of work and routine, becoming a ghost in his own life. The morning of the whisper began like any other Tuesday. Alistair stood before the floor-to-ceiling window in his study, a room panelled in dark mahogany and smelling of old leather and power. He wasn't admiring the view of the raging sea. He was watching the stock ticker on a discreet monitor, his jaw tight as he tracked the minute fluctuations of his empire. "Sir," a soft voice said from the doorway. Alistair didn't turn. "What is it? Clara?" His tone was clipped, impatient. "Mr. Julian is here to see you. He's in the foyer." Alistair's shoulders tensed. Julian. The name itself felt like a nettle against his skin. His son was a painter. A painter. The word was absurd in Alistair's world of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers. Julian had his mother's soft heart and none of his father's steel. "I don't have time for him," Alistair said flatly. "Tell him the meeting in Zurich was moved up. I'm busy." Clara May hesitated, her hands clasped in front of her crisp black uniform. This was a breach of her silent protocol, but she held her ground. "Sir, it's about the annual Eleanor Finch Foundation Gala. He wanted to discuss the theme. He has some ideas he believes would honor his mother's memory." Alistair finally turned his gaze sharp and dismissive. "Honor her memory. He honors her memory by wasting his life on canvases that will never sell. The foundation is a financial instrument, a tax write-off, and a public relations necessity. The theme will be a legacy of strength. Simple, powerful. It reflects the Finch name. Tell my son that. And tell him not to interrupt my workday again." Clara May's expression remained placid, but a flicker of something sadness resolve passed through her dark, intelligent eyes. She had seen this exchange 100 times, the cold dismissal, the casual cruelty that Alistair mistook for strength. She gave a slight, respectful nod. "Yes, sir." She turned and left her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. Alistair watched her go, a fleeting irritation passing through him. The woman was too familiar. She had been there too long. He turned back to the window, dismissing both his son and his maid from his thoughts, and focused once more on the numbers, the only language he truly trusted. But down in the grand, empty foyer, Clara May did not deliver the message with Alistair's coldness. She found Julian standing by a marble statue of Apollo, his shoulders slumped in a familiar posture of defeat. He was tall and slender, with Eleanor's kind eyes and a shock of unruly dark hair that he constantly pushed from his forehead. "He's busy," Clara May said softly, her voice a balm. "The Zurich call." Julian gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Zurich, of course. It's always Zurich or Shanghai or some other place that's more important than his own son." He looked at Clara May, his expression softening. "Thanks for trying, Clara. You're the only one who does." "Your mother would have loved your ideas, Julian," she said, her gaze steady. "She loved your art. She saw the world in it." Tears pricked at Julian's eyes, and he blinked them away fiercely. "Yeah, well, she's not here, is she?" He turned and walked towards the heavy oak doors, his footsteps echoing in the vast, lonely space. "Neither is he really," he muttered, before stepping out into the grey, wind-swept day. Clara May watched him go, her heart aching. For 20 years she had dusted the furniture, polished the silver, and held the family's secrets in the silent chambers of her heart. She had watched a family slowly disintegrate, held together only by the cold glue of wealth. But a promise was a promise, and the one she'd made to Eleanor Finch on her deathbed was a weight she had carried for 5 long years. Today she had decided was the day she would finally lay that burden down, no matter the consequences. The silence in Greycliff Manor was about to be broken. The afternoon sun, weak and watery, cast long shadows across Alistair Finch's study. The relentless march of the stock ticker was the room's only pulse. Alistair had spent the hours since Julian's departure in a flurry of brutal efficiency. He had negotiated the acquisition of a smaller tech firm, verbally dismantled a senior vice president over a flawed quarterly report, and reallocated $300 million with the detached precision of a surgeon. He was in his element, a king upon his throne of numbers and consequence. He was reviewing a contract, his pen hovering over the signature line, when a soft knock came at the door. It opened before he could answer. Clara May Thompson stepped inside, closing the heavy door behind her, with a soft click that seemed to cannonade through the silence. She was not carrying a tray, nor was she there for any of her usual duties. She simply stood there, her hands clasped, her posture erect, and imbued with a quiet dignity that was somehow defiant. Alistair looked up his annoyance, a palpable force in the room. "I gave specific instructions that I was not to be disturbed, Clara." "I know, sir," she replied, her voice calm and even. It lacked its usual deference. In its place was a profound and unsettling gravity. "But this cannot wait." "Whatever it is, it can—" He snapped his eyes, returning to the document. "The world doesn't stop for housekeeping matters." She took a step forward, and then another. She walked directly to his massive mahogany desk a piece of furniture that served as a barricade between him and the rest of the world. She stopped just before it, forcing him to look up at her. He saw then that the placid mask was gone. Her eyes held a deep, sorrowful resolve. He had never seen her look this way, and for the first time in decades, a flicker of uncertainty pierced his armor. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "It has been 5 years, Mr. Finch," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Yet it filled the room. 5 years since Mrs. Eleanor passed. Alistair's face hardened into a granite mask. The mention of his wife's name from the lips of a servant was an unforgivable transgression. "You are far, far out of line. Your employment here is terminated. Get out." He expected her to flinch, to stammer an apology, to retreat. She did none of these things. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "You can fire me, sir. You can have me thrown out. But you need to hear what I have to say first. I made a promise to her. My last promise." The sheer audacity of her defiance was so stunning that Alistair was momentarily speechless. He leaned back in his leather chair, a muscle twitching in his jaw. This was a disruption to the order he had so meticulously built. He would deal with it, crush it, and restore the silence. "You have 1 minute," he said, his voice dripping with ice. Clara May took a deep breath, her hands trembling, almost imperceptibly. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so that it was intimate, conspiratorial, and utterly terrifying in its closeness. "Sir," she whispered the sound, cutting through the air like a shard of glass. "It's about Mrs. Eleanor's final letter. The one you never found. The one she wrote to you the day she died." The world stopped. The stock ticker, the distant hum of the servers, the sound of the wind against the glass, it all vanished. Alistair's mind, a machine of logic and calculation, ground to a halt. A letter he had searched for one. In the weeks after Eleanor's death, in a haze of grief and rage, he had torn her office apart, desperate for a final word, a last goodbye. He had found nothing. He had concluded she had been too weak, too tired, too defeated at the end to even write one. It was a story he had told himself, another brick in the wall around his heart. "There was no letter," he stated, but the words came out as a croak. The ice in his voice had cracked. "Oh, but there was, sir," Clara May continued, her whisper relentless. "She gave it to me to hide. She said you wouldn't look in the right place. She said you only saw the value of things, not their meaning." Alistair stared at her, his mind reeling. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid floor beneath him had turned to sand. Clara May, his silent, invisible maid, was suddenly the most powerful person in the room. She held a piece of his past, a piece of Eleanor that he never knew existed. "Where?" The word was a demand, but it was hollow, stripped of its usual authority. It was a plea. Clara May's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She told me you would never think to look in her copy of Whitman, the old dog-eared one she kept by her bed. You always called it sentimental nonsense." The book. Leaves of Grass. It was still there on the bedside table in the master suite he had sealed off 5 years ago, a perfect museum of his grief. He had never touched it. He remembered her reading from it, her voice soft and full of a passion he couldn't comprehend. He remembered scoffing at it. Sentimental nonsense. The words echoed back at him a damning indictment. The fortress Alistair Finch had built around himself began to crumble. Not with a bang, but with a silent, catastrophic implosion. The cold, hard shell of the billionaire cracked open, and the raw, untended grief of the husband poured out. His carefully controlled composure shattered. His face, for years a mask of impenetrable authority, contorted with a pain so profound it was shocking to behold. A strangled sob escaped his lips. His body began to shake, tremors running through his expensive suit. He clutched the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white as if trying to hold on to the solid reality that was dissolving around him. And then Alistair Finch, the titan of industry, the man who moved markets and made governments tremble, burst into tears. He didn't just cry. He wept, deep, ragged, gut-wrenching sobs that tore through the oppressive silence of the study. He covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders heaving with 5 years of repressed agony, regret, and a sudden terrible understanding of all he had lost, not just in her death, but in her life. Clara May stood by the desk, her duty done. She did not move to comfort him. This was a private grief, a storm that had to break. She simply stood as a silent witness, just as she had for 20 years, as the great Alistair Finch finally utterly came apart. The storm of Alistair's grief subsided into a ragged, desolate calm. He sat slumped in his chair, his face in his hands, the sounds of his weeping replaced by the shuddering breaths of a man utterly undone. The pristine facade of the Billionaire was gone, leaving only a broken, aging man in its place. Clara May remained by the desk, a silent, unmoving pillar of resolve. After what felt like an eternity, Alistair slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw, his face pale. He looked at Clara May, not as an employer to a subordinate, but as one human being to another, his gaze stripped of all its former arrogance. "Leave me," he rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. Clara May gave a single understanding nod. "The room is as she left it, sir. The book is on the nightstand, on her side." She then turned and exited the study as silently as she had entered, closing the door behind her and leaving Alistair alone with the ghost she had just resurrected. For a long time he didn't move. He felt paralyzed, pinned to his chair by the weight of a past he had so deliberately ignored. The master suite. He had ordered it sealed, preserved under dust cloths, a perfect time capsule of his loss. He hadn't set foot in it since the week after the funeral. The pain had been too immense, a physical entity he could not bear to face. Now he had to. With movements that were stiff and uncertain, Alistair pushed himself up from his chair. He walked out of his study, his legs unsteady, and crossed the grand hall. He bypassed the main staircase, instead taking the private spiraling one that led directly to the master wing. Each step was a labor. Each step took him closer to her and further away from the man he had been just an hour before. The air in the hallway outside their bedroom was still and cool. He reached for the ornate brass doorknob, his hand trembling so violently he could barely grasp it. He turned it. The latch clicked a sound that seemed to echo through the empty manor and into the deepest parts of his soul. He pushed the door open. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn. A faint, ghostly scent of her perfume lavender and rain still lingered in the air. Everything was draped in white dust sheets, giving the furniture the appearance of silent, shrouded figures. It was a mausoleum. His mausoleum. Alistair walked directly to the right side of the canopied bed. Her side. He pulled back the sheet covering the bedside table. And there it was. A worn blue book with a frayed spine, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Its cover was soft from years of her touch. He picked it up. It felt warm, alive, as if it still held the heat of her hands. He fumbled through the pages, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. The paper was thin, the edges softened with age. And then he saw it. Tucked between the pages of Song of Myself was a single folded sheet of her personal stationery, a pale cream color embossed with a simple IF. His breath hitched. It was real. Clara May hadn't been lying. With trembling fingers, Alistair unfolded the letter. Her handwriting, a graceful looping cursive he hadn't seen in 5 years, filled the page. He sank onto the edge of the dust-covered bed and began to read. My dearest Alistair, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that Clara May has finally found the courage to fulfill my last wish. Please do not be angry with her. I asked her to wait. I asked her to give this to you only when she felt your heart was ready to hear it, or when it became so closed off that it had no other choice. I am writing this from the sunroom, watching the gulls dive into the grey sea. It is beautiful today. I wish you were here to see it with me, truly see it, not just glance at it between calls to Singapore. There is so much I want to say, so many words that went unspoken between us, lost in the chasm of board meetings and stock prices. I want you to know, first and foremost, that I loved you. I fell in love with a fierce, brilliant young man who had a fire in his eyes to build a better world. I see that man still in rare, quiet moments. I know he is in there, buried beneath the weight of the empire you have built. But in building that empire, my love, you have built a fortress around your heart, and you have locked us out. Me and, more importantly, Julian. This is my secret, Alistair. My confession. In these last few years, I have been so terribly lonely. Not for friends or parties, but for you, for your laugh, for your hand in mine, without the distraction of a vibrating phone. I have watched you grow more distant, more obsessed with a legacy written in numbers, while our true legacy, our beautiful, sensitive son, became a footnote in your life. Julian is not a disappointment. He is a gift. He has my heart, but he has your fire, Alistair. You just can't see it, because it burns differently. It is the fire of creation, of passion, of seeing the beauty and pain in the world, and trying to make sense of it on a canvas. He is more like you than you know. He feels everything so deeply, just as you once did, before you taught yourself not to. My dying wish is not for the company, or the foundation, or the Finch name. It is for you and Julian. Please, my love, find him. See him. Not as the heir who has failed to meet your expectations, but as the boy who used to show you his crayon drawings, with such pride in his eyes, searching your face for the approval you so rarely gave. Do not let your legacy be this cold, empty house. Let it be him. Break down the walls you have built. Learn to speak his language. Discover the man he has become. It is the only acquisition that will ever truly matter. All my love for all time. Eleanor Alistair finished the letter, the paper shaking in his hand. The words were not an accusation, but a plea. They were a testament to a love he had taken for granted, and a loneliness he had been blind to. He hadn't just lost his wife. He had allowed her to slip away while she was still alive, lost in the shadow of his ambition. And Julian. Every word about their son was a dagger to his heart. He saw it all with a blinding, horrific clarity. Every dismissive comment, every cancelled meeting, every sigh of disappointment. He had been trying to forge his son into a copy of himself, while Eleanor had been trying to save the beautiful, unique soul he already was. He read the letter again, and then a third time, the ink blurring through the fresh tears that streamed down his face. This grief was different. It was sharper, more profound. It was the grief of regret. He had not only failed his wife in her life, but he had spent the 5 years since her death betraying her final wish. He carefully folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket pocket, pressing it against his chest. It felt like a searing brand. He stood up and looked around the shrouded room, seeing it not as a shrine to his loss, but as a monument to his failure. He walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind him, letting the light from the hallway spill into the dusty darkness for the first time in 5 years. He knew what he had to do. The path forward was no longer about balance sheets or stock prices. It was about a promise to Eleanor. It was about finding his son. Armed with Eleanor's words, Alistair Finch felt a tectonic shift within him. The grief was still a raw, open wound, but now it was accompanied by a new, unfamiliar sensation, a desperate sense of purpose that had nothing to do with Finch Global. He strode through the manor. His steps are now imbued with an urgency that startled the household staff. He went straight to his study, but ignored the blinking monitors and stacks of files. He picked up his phone. He didn't have to look up Julian's number, but he hesitated before dialing, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. What would he even say? "Hello, son. I've just discovered I've been a failure as a father for the past 25 years. Care for lunch?" The thought was paralyzing. He took a breath, the paper in his pocket, a crinkling reminder of his promise, and dialed. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Julian's voice, cool and detached, recited the generic message. "Julian, it's your father." Alistair began, his voice rough. I need to speak with you. It's important. Please call me back." He hung up the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. For the next hour, Alistair paced his study like a caged lion. He, a man who could get the President of France on the line with a single call, was waiting anxiously for his own son to return his call. The irony was galling. He tried to work to immerse himself in the familiar comfort of numbers, but the figures on the screen were meaningless squiggles. Eleanor's handwriting was superimposed over everything he saw. Finally, his phone buzzed. Julian's name flashed on the screen. Alistair snatched it up. "Julian." "I got your message." Julian's voice was wary, laced with suspicion. "Is something wrong with the Foundation? Did you decide a legacy of infighting was a better theme?" The sarcasm stung, but for the first time, Alistair understood its source. It was a shield forged over years of his own neglect. "No," Alistair said, his voice softer than Julian had likely ever heard it. "It's not about the Foundation. I want to see you. Can you come to the house?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I was just there. You were busy with Zurich." "I was wrong," Alistair said. The admission felt like pulling teeth, but it was the truth. "I was wrong. I'm not busy now. Please, Julian." The silence stretched. Julian was likely trying to work out the angle, the hidden agenda. Finally, he sighed. "Fine. I'll be there in 30 minutes. But if this is about me joining the board again, I'm turning right back around." "It's not," Alistair promised. True to his word, Julian arrived 30 minutes later. Alistair met him not in the study, but in the sunroom, Eleanor's favourite room. It was a space he rarely entered, filled with plants she had tended and comfortable, slightly worn furniture he had always considered too sentimental. Julian walked in, his expression guarded. He stopped short when he saw his father standing there looking different. Alistair wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was loosened, and his face was etched with an emotion Julian couldn't quite identify. It looked like exhaustion, but deeper. "What's this about?" Julian asked, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Alistair gestured to an armchair opposite his own. "Sit, please." Julian sat reluctantly on the edge of the cushion, poised to flee. Alistair took a deep breath, the words of the letter burning in his mind. Learn to speak his language. He looked at his son, truly, looked at him not as a flawed successor, but as a young man with his mother's eyes. "I went to your last gallery show." Alistair began, the words coming out in a rush. Julian's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "What? No, you didn't. I would have seen you. I came late, after the main crowd had left," Alistair admitted, shamefaced. "I didn't want to make a scene. I wore a hat. I stood in the back." This was so out of character that Julian was rendered speechless. His father, the great Alistair Finch, skulking in the back of a small downtown art gallery. It was unthinkable. "There was one painting," Alistair continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength as he clung to the memory. "The one of the empty lighthouse. The storm raging around it. You called it The Watcher." Julian stared at him. That was one of his most personal pieces. It was about loneliness, about standing guard over an empty promise. He had poured all his feelings of abandonment into that canvas. "What about it?" Julian asked, his voice tight. "I didn't understand it then," Alistair said, his gaze meeting his son's directly. "I thought it was bleak, morbid, but I understand it now. I was the lighthouse, wasn't I, standing there empty while the storm was all around?" The air crackled with unspoken history. Julian's defensive posture began to soften, replaced by a profound confusion. "Where is this coming from? Did you have a medical scare? Did a doctor tell you to make amends?" Alistair gave a sad, bitter smile. "Something like that. Julian, your mother, she left a letter." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cream-colored paper. He didn't hand it over. It was too raw, too personal. "She wrote it the day she died. I only found it today. She talked about us. About you. About how I failed to see the incredible man you've become." His voice broke on the last few words. Julian's cynical armor dissolved completely, replaced by a look of stunned vulnerability. He saw the genuine pain in his father's eyes, the unshed tears. This wasn't a corporate maneuver. It was a reckoning. She wrote about me," he whispered. "She loved your art." Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. "She said you had my fire, but that it burned differently. She was so proud of you, Julian. And I was so blind, so damnably arrogantly blind." For the first time in their lives, the chasm between them seemed to shrink. Julian saw not the imposing billionaire, but a grieving man, his father, reaching across a bridge built of the jagged, broken shards of their past. I don't know what to say," Julian stammered. "Don't say anything," Alistair pleaded, leaning forward, his hands clasped. "Just let me try. Let me start over. Let me get to know my own son. We could go to a museum. The Met. You could show me what you see. Teach me." The offer was so simple, so alien, and yet so profoundly meaningful. It was an admission of fallibility, a request for help, a white flag in a war Julian hadn't even realized they were both fighting. Tears welled in Julian's eyes, mirroring his father's. He gave a slow, hesitant nod. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "Okay, Dad." It was just one word, but in the quiet of Eleanor's sunroom, it sounded like a new beginning, a fragile, tentative peace accord signed in the heart of a broken family. But outside the walls of Greycliff Manor, in the cold, calculating world of Finch Global, the tremors of Alistair's transformation were beginning to be felt. And not everyone saw his newfound humanity as a virtue. Alistair Finch's change was not subtle. In the week following his discovery of Eleanor's letter, the man who had ruled Finch Global with an iron fist began to rule with a distracted heart. He started leaving the office at 5:30, an act so unprecedented that his executive assistant had called security, assuming he'd had a medical emergency. He cancelled a trip to Hong Kong in favor of spending a Saturday at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with Julian. The museum trip was a revelation. Julian, initially awkward, soon found his passion explaining the emotional brushstrokes of a Van Gogh and the rebellious geometry of a Picasso. Alistair, for his part, listened. For the first time, he wasn't calculating the auction value of the art, but trying to see the story within the frame. He saw the world through his son's eyes, a world of colour, emotion, and nuance he had long since forgotten. It was exhausting and exhilarating. But while Alistair was rediscovering his son, his empire was beginning to feel the absence of its tyrant. Decisions were being deferred. Calls went unreturned. His famous ruthlessness seemed to have been replaced by a pensive, almost melancholic introspection. And in the shark tank of corporate finance, vulnerability smells like blood in the water. No one smelled it more keenly than Marcus Thorne. Marcus was Finch Global's chief operating officer, a man as sharp and polished as a razor's edge. He was Alistair's protégé, hand-picked and moulded in Alistair's own former image, ambitious, brilliant, and utterly devoid of sentiment. For years, Marcus had been the loyal number 2, waiting patiently for his time. He saw Alistair's sudden shift not as a personal healing, but as a catastrophic failure of leadership. The old lion was losing his teeth. Marcus began his campaign subtly. He'd make quiet comments in the executive lounge. Has anyone else noticed Alistair seems off his game? He'd muse to other board members. He passed on the Atocorp acquisition. The old Alistair would have torn them to shreds and sold the pieces for a profit by breakfast. He started convening informal meetings after hours with key investors and disgruntled VPs. He painted a picture of a brilliant founder in decline and emotional liability, whose newfound family focus was putting the entire $50 billion company at risk. The tipping point came during a critical board meeting. They were discussing a hostile takeover bid for a rival energy company, a classic Alistair Finch power play. The plan was aggressive, borderline predatory, and guaranteed to yield massive returns. Everyone expected Alistair to lead the charge with his usual bloodthirsty glee. Instead, Alistair was hesitant. He stared at the projected financials, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about a conversation with Julian about the environmental impact of such companies, about the stark, desolate landscapes Julian had once painted, inspired by corporate greed. "I'm not sure," Alistair said, breaking the expectant silence. "Their pension fund is already underwater. This move would liquidate it. Thousands of families would be affected." The room was stunned into silence. Alistair Finch, worrying about families, Marcus Thorne saw his opening. "With all due respect, Alistair," Marcus said, his voice smooth and laced with condescending concern. "We are not a charity. We are a corporation with a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. This is a $10 billion opportunity. Your father, your grandfather, the founders of this company's spirit, they wouldn't hesitate." The mention of his family legacy was a deliberate, calculated strike, but the name that now defined Alistair's legacy was Eleanor. "The world has changed, Marcus," Alistair replied, his voice weary. "Perhaps we need to change with it." That was all Marcus needed. The next day, he made his move. He used his significant influence to call for an emergency board meeting. The agenda item was discreetly labeled, "A review of executive leadership and future strategy." The true purpose was a corporate coup d'etat. Marcus had rallied a majority of the board, convincing them that Alistair was no longer fit to lead. He was going to trigger a key person clause in the company bylaws to force Alistair into a ceremonial, powerless chairman emeritus role and seize the CEO position for himself. Alistair was blindsided. His assistant, loyal to him for 30 years, tearfully informed him of the meeting and its true intent. The betrayal from Marcus, a man he had mentored, was a bitter pill. It was a stark reminder that the world he had created had no room for the man he was trying to become. He was trapped. To fight back would mean becoming the ruthless monster he had just escaped. To surrender would be to lose the empire he had spent his life building, the only thing he had thought to leave to his son. The night before the board meeting, Alistair sat alone in his cavernous study, the blinking ticker, a mocking reminder of the kingdom he was about to lose. He felt old, tired, and utterly defeated. He was staring into the abyss when a soft knock came at the door. Julian entered, holding 2 mugs. He'd been staying at the manor more often, tentatively rebuilding the bridges between them. "Clara told me you didn't come down for dinner," Julian said, placing a mug of tea on the desk. "Figured you could use this." He saw the look on his father's face, the deep lines of stress and despair. "What's wrong? Is it about the company?" Alistair didn't have the energy to lie. He told Julian everything. About Marcus's betrayal, the board meeting, the impending vote he was sure to lose. He laid it all out, the clinical, brutal mechanics of his own professional execution. "I don't know how to fight him." "Julian," Alistair confessed the admission, costing him his last ounce of pride. "Not without becoming the man I no longer want to be." Julian listened intently, his artistic mind processing the problem from a different angle. He wasn't thinking about stock prices or shareholder value. He was thinking about character motivation and weakness. "This guy, Marcus," Julian said slowly, "you taught him everything he knows, right? He's a copy of you, the old you." "A perfect copy," Alistair agreed bitterly. "No," Julian said, a spark igniting in his eyes. "No copy is ever perfect. They always miss the source code. They replicate the moves, but they don't understand the instinct." "What's his weakness?" Alistair looked at his son, truly seeing him, not just as an artist, but as a strategist with a different kind of intelligence. "His weakness," Alistair mused, "is his arrogance. He believes he's me. He believes he's already won." A slow smile spread across Julian's face. "Good," he said, pulling a chair up to the desk. "Then let's use that. You might not want to be the old Alistair Finch anymore. But for one more day, I think you're going to have to let me be his son." For the first time in days, a glimmer of the old fire returned to Alistair's eyes. The lion wasn't dead yet. And now, he wasn't fighting alone. The Finch Global boardroom was a theater of silent warfare. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces of the board members, men and women who had ridden Alistair's coattails to immense wealth and were now prepared to cut him loose. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the table, a position he had symbolically taken, exuding an aura of calm, predatory confidence. He had the votes. This was a formality. Alistair Finch entered the room precisely on time, but he was not alone. Beside him walked Julian. The board members exchanged surprised, dismissive glances. Bringing the artist's son the family disappointment to his own execution, it was a pathetic, sentimental gesture. Marcus smirked. This was even better than he had hoped. "Alistair, good of you to join us." Marcus began, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "While it's lovely to see Julian, this is a closed board meeting. He is here at my request." Alistair stated, his voice even and devoid of the stress they expected. He and Julian took their seats. "My son has recently taken a keen interest in the family business. He's here to observe." Marcus shrugged, magnanimous in his victory. "As you wish. Let's begin." He launched into his meticulously prepared speech. He spoke of a company at a crossroads, of the need for dynamic, forward-thinking leadership. He praised Alistair's historic contributions while subtly painting him as a relic, a man who had lost his edge. He presented charts and projections, all pointing to a future that would stagnate under Alistair's new hesitant philosophy. Therefore, Marcus concluded, his eyes sweeping the table, it is with a heavy heart that I propose we exercise the key person clause and transition Alistair to the role of Chairman Emeritus, while I assume the responsibilities of CEO effective immediately. He looked at Alistair, expecting a defeated sigh. Instead, Alistair nodded slowly. A compelling presentation, Marcus. You learned my methods well. He then turned his gaze to the board. Before you vote, my son has a small presentation of his own. A postscript, if you will, to Marcus's vision of the future. The board members shifted uncomfortably. A presentation from the painter. This was absurd. Julian stood up. He wasn't dressed in a suit, but in a simple, well-tailored dark blazer and slacks. He looked calm, his artist's eyes taking in every person in the room. He carried no notes, no tablet. "Good morning," Julian began, his voice clear and steady. "My father is right. I've spent my life observing, not balance sheets, but people. And in observing Mr. Thorne, I've noticed he emulates my father's classic strategies. One of those is the art of distraction." He walked towards the large screen at the end of the room. "Mr. Thorne has presented you with a threat, my father's supposed decline. But while you've all been focused on that, you've missed the real threat." He clicked a remote. The screen lit up, not with financial charts, but with a complex diagram of shell corporations and offshore accounts, all linked like a spider's web. "This," Julian said, his voice hardening, "is a network of companies registered in the Cayman Islands. They have one thing in common: their sole director is a man named Robert Davis." A few board members frowned. The name meant nothing. Marcus Thorne's calm expression flickered for the first time. "Robert Davis," Julian continued, "is Marcus Thorne's brother-in-law. Over the past 6 months, these companies have been quietly acquiring a significant non-disclosed stake in a small, innovative German tech firm, Ethelred Robotics. A company Finch Global was in final negotiations to acquire 3 months ago, until Mr. Thorne himself advised my father that the deal was too risky and overvalued." The atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew thick with suspicion. "Last night," Julian said, "I got curious. My father mentioned the deal, and I as an artist appreciate German design. So I did some digging. I used a data analysis program, one I normally use to track art auction provenances, to trace Ethelred's patent filings and investor information. It turns out Ethelred is on the verge of announcing a revolutionary battery patent, one that will make their stock value increase by an estimated 500% in the next quarter." He turned to face Marcus, whose face had gone pale. "Mr. Thorne's plan was simple, and I admit quite elegant in its treachery," Julian announced to the silent room. "He convinces my father, his mentor, to pass on a golden opportunity. He uses his inside knowledge and a proxy network to buy up the company for pennies on the dollar. Then he ousts my father, takes control of Finch Global, and announces his first bold move as CEO, acquiring Ethelred Robotics at its new, massively inflated price. Finch Global pays a premium, and hundreds of millions of dollars are funneled directly into the pockets of its new CEO. It's a brilliant predatory move. My father would have been proud if it weren't treason." The silence was shattered. Marcus shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "This is slander, an outrageous fantasy from a boy who knows nothing of business. Is it?" Alistair's voice cut through the air like a whip. He stood and placed a single file on the table. "This is the flight manifest for your private jet to Stuttgart twice last month, Marcus. And these are sworn affidavits from 2 junior analysts in your department whom you ordered to bury the initial Ethelred prospectus. They were uncomfortable with the directive, and thankfully they believe more in loyalty than in ambition. The board stared first at the file, then at Marcus Thorne, whose arrogant composure had completely disintegrated. He was exposed, his meticulous plan undone, not by a rival CEO, but by the artist's son he had never even considered a threat. Alistair Finch looked around the table, his old fire blazing in his eyes, but it was tempered now with a new wisdom. "I may have become hesitant about destroying a company for profit," he said, his voice resonating with renewed authority. "But I have no hesitation about excising a cancer from my own." He looked directly at Marcus. "You are fired. Security will escort you out. I suggest you find a very good lawyer." Marcus Thorne, the brilliant protégé, stood there for a moment, utterly defeated. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his career in ruins. Alistair then turned back to his stunned board. "Is there any other business?" he asked quietly. There was none. He had not only survived the coup, he had emerged stronger, not just as a leader, but as a father. Julian stood beside him, and for the first time the boardroom saw him not as the artist's son, but as a Finch. A different kind of Finch with a different kind of fire. And perhaps they realized that was exactly what the company needed. In the aftermath of the failed coup, a new kind of silence settled over Greycliff Manor. It was not the oppressive, sterile silence of before, but a peaceful quiet, punctuated now by conversation, by the clinking of teacups in the sunroom, even by the occasional sound of laughter. The ghosts had not been banished, but they had been invited to sit at the table. Alistair Finch was a changed man. The transformation was visible not just to his son, but to everyone around him. He still ran his empire, but his focus had shifted from ruthless expansion to sustainable legacy. He spearheaded the Eleanor Finch Foundation with genuine passion, turning it from a tax shelter into a powerful force for arts education, appointing Julian as its head. Julian, in turn, thrived his creative vision, giving the foundation a purpose it had never known. He balanced this new responsibility with his painting, finding that his art was richer and deeper, now that the shadows of his father's disapproval had lifted. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alistair found Clara May Thompson arranging a bouquet of late-blooming roses in the foyer. He approached her not as an employer, but as a friend. "Clara." He began, his voice filled with a warmth she had never heard from him before. "I have never properly thanked you." Clara May turned a small, knowing smile on her lips. "You don't need to, sir. I was only keeping a promise." "You did more than that," Alistair said, his gaze earnest. "You gave me back my son. You gave me back my wife's memory in its truest form. You saved me from myself. A paycheck and a thank you seem wholly inadequate for that." He paused, then continued. "I am restructuring my personal estate. I want you to be the head of the household, not as a maid, but as an administrator. Your salary will be tripled. But more than that, I am setting up a trust. In your name. It will guarantee your comfort for the rest of your life. It's the very least I can do." Tears welled in Clara May's eyes. Not of sadness, but of profound, quiet joy. For 20 years she had served this family. Now they were finally serving her in return. "Thank you, Alistair," she said, using his first name for the very first time. It felt natural. "Right." Later that week, Alistair and Julian stood on the cliffside lawn overlooking the Atlantic. The wind whipped at their coats, but the sun was bright. They weren't speaking of business or art, but simply enjoying the shared silence. "You know," Julian said, breaking the quiet, "I finished a new painting. I want you to see it." He led his father not to a gallery, but to the manor's grand ballroom, a space that hadn't been used in years. In the centre of the room, on a large easel, was a canvas. Alistair looked at it, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a portrait, but it was a portrait of 3 people. On the left was Alistair himself, not the fearsome titan of business, but the man he was now, his face softer, his eyes holding a hint of a smile. On the right was Julian, looking at his father with warmth and understanding, and standing between them, her form translucent, almost ethereal, with one hand on Alistair's shoulder and the other on Julian's, was Eleanor. She was smiling, her face radiant with a love that transcended time and loss. It wasn't a painting of grief. It was a painting of healing, of a family finally made whole. Tears streamed freely down Alistair Finch's face, but for the first time in his life, they were not tears of regret or sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. He had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, measuring his success in billions of dollars. But as he stood there, his son by his side, and the spirit of his wife captured in vibrant color before him, he finally understood the truth. His greatest treasure was not in a vault or a stock portfolio. It was right here. It had been here all along. The secret the maid had whispered had not destroyed his world. It had given him a new one infinitely more valuable than the one he had lost. Alistair Finch's story reminds us that the most valuable secrets are not found in corporate vaults, but are hidden in the quiet corners of the human heart. It took a single act of courage from a loyal friend to shatter a billionaire's gilded cage and reveal a truth more powerful than any stock price, that true wealth isn't what you own, but who you love and how you are loved in return. The whispered words of a maid didn't just bring a titan to tears. They resurrected a father, healed a son, and honored the memory of a wife whose love proved to be the greatest legacy of all. What did you think of Alistair's transformation? Can a person truly change that much, that late in life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that explore the incredible depths of the human experience. Thank you for watching.